It's Friday, the 13th of October, 2023. Welcome to the Weekly News. Hey guys, it's Josh from the WL Tech blog, and this is the weekly Linux and open source news. Thanks for joining. Well, last week was all about security bugs, and guess what? There's more this week to get to. Starting off with curl. This week we have a critical bug in curl, the software and library for HTTP and related protocol requests. Now, to trigger this bug, you have to be using a SOCKS proxy, which the vast majority of us aren't doing on workstations, but a PHP script could easily exploit it. If you're doing web hosting or otherwise running PHP scripts, that's probably the easiest way to be affected by this bug. Curl 8.4.0 has the fix. If you tuned in last week, my editorial was about encouraging people to use safe languages, and the maintainer of curl even called that out in his write-up of the bug. He claims that 40% of security-related bugs in curl would have been impossible using a safe language like Rust, but the momentum of building a compatible rewrite isn't there, and particularly they depend on many other components which are not written in safe languages. Make sure you get those updates, especially if you're using PHP in a container. The official PHP containers have been updated with this fix. HTTP 2 Rapid Reset. Now, this isn't a bug in a particular piece of software, it's rather an oversight in the protocol. Rapid Reset is a newly disclosed attack on web servers that implement the HTTP 2 protocol, where a client is able to cancel a request immediately after making it. In nearly all application servers, the backend will continue to process that request as there generally aren't mechanisms to end a running job. This greatly simplifies creating a denial of service attack, as the client can simply request and cancel over and over without needing to wait for or handle any response. This affects essentially all web servers that implement HTTP 2. Some servers already provide some method of rate limiting that can prevent the impact, but these are rarely configured. New releases of some software are already shipping, most others should happen very soon. Notably, Go 1.21.3 was released a few days ago addressing this in the standard library, so any software compiled with it that doesn't explicitly specify an older API will be protected. Okay, enough about security bugs for now. Let's talk about some new software releases this past week. Ubuntu 23.10. We've got the new semi-annual release of Ubuntu now with tons of updates. In their usual cadence, the next release will be LTS, and this is the one where they put their biggest changes, hoping to get user feedback before committing to it for the next 5 years. Among those changes, you get the Linux kernel 6.5, the GNOME 45 desktop running on Wayland, and GCC 13. On supported hardware, it's now possible to take advantage of your computer's TPM for full disk encryption. ZFS is back on the install menu, and the default install is now much smaller than previous versions. They also have ready-to-go releases for Raspberry Pi, including the new Pi 5. If you're more of a KDE fan, Kubuntu was released as well, including a Wayland option that you can test, but it's not the default or really considered to be supported. As far as I can tell, Firefox has been moved to a snap package on all the official Ubuntu spins. You either love it or you hate it. Raspberry Pi OS. With the new Pi 5 being released, they've also bumped up the Raspberry Pi OS, which is now based on Debian 12. Major changes you'll see are a default to the Wayland display server, Pipewire for audio, and the compositor is now Wayfire instead of OpenBox. The display changes are default for the new Pi 5, but not yet for the previous model. You can set them manually, but their statement is that they're not yet optimized for the older boards. Network Manager is now the default for network management. They also highlight the inclusion of a Pi-optimized Firefox, claiming not only hardware video acceleration, but also Widevine support for streaming DRM-encumbered video. Should be a great update for the Pi 5 and Pi 4 models, particularly with higher memory configurations. As of today, I'm still not able to purchase a Pi 5, so the debate on if I get one or not continues. Caddy. Now, this is one that most people haven't used or possibly even heard of, the Caddy Web Server. It's honestly one of my favorite examples of software written in a safe language. It's written in Go, and it has a ton of quality of life features built in. If you're still using Apache or Nginx, maybe give Caddy a look. I find the config file to be much more readable and easier to work with. It has all the nice stuff like automatic HTTPS, fast CGI, reverse proxies, structured logging, safe config reloading, all the things you need in a web server. It's performance competitive with Nginx and has a nice module interface if you want to add your own features in Go. For example, I've written a module to automatically convert JPEG and PNG files to WebP when the browser supports it, and the conversion results in a smaller file, which is great for CMS sites like WordPress, which at best might try to do it in PHP with a plugin. Anyway, they had a release this week. 2.7.5 brings a fix for the HTTP2 rapid reset bug mentioned earlier, along with general performance improvements and more support for customized templates when using the built-in file browser. This is highly recommended software. O3DE 23.10. If you remember a few years back, Amazon was building their own game engine, which they called Project Lumberyard, with the goal of making online games with Amazon Cloud Services on the back end. Amazon eventually changed their mind and handed much of their work to the Linux Foundation under an Apache 2.0 license. The new project is O3DE, and this week they announced 23.10, which notably has the beginnings of mobile device targets. If you're looking for an open 3D engine, it's worth a look at this, even if you ultimately go with Godot instead. Other minor updates. If you're a GUI developer, Qt 6.6 was released with improvements for use in Wayland as well as a mountain of general improvements. Debian has published 12.2 of their OS, which is mostly what you would have with a fully updated Debian 12 system plus a slightly newer kernel. Raspberry Pi and other single board computers. I touched on this a bit in my Raspberry Pi 5 introduction video, but we're going to expand on it a bit here. In 2011, if you wanted a single board, small form factor computer, your options were really limited to PC 104. This was a standardized system for embedded or industrial systems, usually using the same x86 processors and peripherals you'd find on a desktop system, crammed into a 3.5 by 3 3/4 stackable board. These weren't exactly cheap and not targeted to home users. There were some alternatives, but they were generally more expensive and less accessible. The closest us normal folks would get is Mini ITX, which is just a smaller ATX motherboard. In 2012, that all changed with the introduction of the Raspberry Pi. The Pi had meager specs, a low-end ARM CPU, not much memory, it did have video output, some GPIO, and USB, and there was a higher-priced version that included Ethernet. The stated goal was to bring actual computing into education, rather than just teaching kids how to use Microsoft Office. They didn't expect the general public's appetite for a low-cost, Linux-capable computer with video and GPIO. The Pi was a massive success, and over the last almost 12 years, they've kept a nice pace of new and improved models, as well as branching out into microcontrollers, cameras, compute modules, keyboard computers, and a bunch of accessories. Along the way, they gained a massive community following, and there are dozens of Pi-specific operating system images, including the normal Linux distros, but also purpose-built appliance images for things like media players, home automation, retro game emulation, container and cluster nodes, and more. But it's not all sunshine and roses for the Pi. Anyone trying to buy one in the last few years has surely felt the problems they've had with the supply not meeting the demand. There's lots of factors that go into that, but ultimately it was the consumers that suffered, and the popularity of the Pi also brought a slew of competitors who didn't have those problems. For better and sometimes for worse, there are a dozen boards in the same form factor with the same general capabilities, in stock, and ready to ship at various vendors. The competition right now is pretty strong. It's been more than 4 years since the launch of the Pi 4, which was a massive upgrade over the previous generation and made it the top performer at launch. The recently announced Pi 5 is again a great upgrade, but the Pi 4 hasn't been number one for most of its existence. Rockchip boards have been outperforming the Pi 4 for years, and in many tests still beat out the Pi 5 that you can't even buy yet, for similar pricing. But, you say, what about software support? I'd like to make 2 main points here. First being that the GPU is generally the only piece with questionable support, and that most vendors have an official OS build that supports it well. And the second, that the Pi's hardware support really hasn't been all that amazing. I've owned basically every Pi since the original. If you ignore all the binary blobs and out-of-tree drivers, those first boards worked pretty well. Once they started adding things like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, that got a lot more complicated. Wi-Fi sounds great, but many users had problems with it dying under various circumstances. I was one of them, and eventually gave up on trying to use the Pi as an access point and internet gateway. Later, I would try very hard to get my Pi to provide a Bluetooth serial console, which despite having explicit support for coexistence with Wi-Fi, would cause Bluetooth and Wi-Fi to both die. Both of these issues affected many users, and have hundreds of replies on the Pi official GitHub going back years, and both are still open and unresolved. I find this part pretty tough to reconcile, especially knowing the close relationship Pi has with their chip suppliers and the huge number of pieces they've sold. Being so tied to Broadcom, it's not surprising that their choices of parts are limited, but most of those other brands have Bluetooth and Wi-Fi as well, and are using a common chip you'll find in laptops and USB dongles with good driver support and very few surprises. Now there's one area where Pi comes out on top, and that's the community around it. Last year they announced they had sold more than 40 million units since 2012. That's a lot of people doing a lot of things all over the world, and you can get a lot of help if you run into trouble. But how much of that help is actually specific to the Pi? The only times I've needed help, it was for a Pi-specific problem, like enabling USB boot and problems with the Wi-Fi. Now maybe you're a beginner and need some hand-holding, in which case that community might be more meaningful to you. I'm more indifferent on this. The answers I needed should have come from Raspberry Pi directly. Of course, this wouldn't be a fair talk if I didn't include options that weren't ARM or weren't the same form factor as the Pi. We're getting more RISC-V boards all the time, and the performance is catching up, not to mention the added cool factor, which can be part of why someone is attracted to a Pi in the first place. A RISC-V competitor is going to be cooler than this year's iteration of ARM. And then we have x86 systems. A few of these exist in the Pi form factor, but does that even matter for you? Are you using the GPIO? Are you using the CSI and DSI ports? If not, is the Pi form factor helping or hurting? If you're just getting started and need to buy a Pi and all the accessories necessary to make it useful, that same amount of money would buy you a brand new mini computer from Amazon that'll be faster, have better Linux support, more memory, more storage, and it can do silly tricks like run Windows 11. The jobs I have for my Pi 4 are well within its capabilities, so I'm not in a rush to upgrade, but when that time comes, I'll be considering all of these options. In the meantime, my little Linux box hobby has been all about MIPS lately, including a Tinkerboard we're building over at Discord. Well, those are all the highlights from this week. Did I miss something? Let me know in the comments. I'll be posting these videos every Friday. If you've got a great project update that should be featured, put it down below and I'll have a look. Also, if you're a fan of tech projects, come check us out at Discord. The link's below. Have a great week, and we'll see you next Friday.